In a world where economic power often shapes political destiny, a new storm is rising from West Africa, a storm fueled not by weapons or armies, but by accusations sharp enough to cut through decades of silence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader reshaping Burkina Faso's future, has stepped onto a global stage with a claim that challenges some of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. And according to African analysts watching the shift unfold, it is a claim that could fundamentally alter the continent's relationship with the West. What follows is the inside story, how Traoré's bold allegations, long whispered in African economic circles, are now forcing uncomfortable questions about sovereignty, wealth, and a financial system many believe was designed to keep Africa dependent. The story truly begins in a closed-door economic roundtable in Ouagadougou, a session that was intended to be quiet, technical, and uneventful. Instead, according to those present, Traoré stunned the room by shifting the discussion from policy to history, a kind of history that African governments rarely confront so openly. He reportedly opened a folder filled with decades-old reports, documents, and financial graphs compiled by Burkina Faso's new economic audit team. These documents, though not publicly released, were described by local economists as containing a pattern, one that pointed toward systematic extraction of African wealth far beyond normal commercial arrangements. According to senior Burkinabe officials, Traoré listed example after example of how Western banks, through interest rate manipulation, reserve requirements, dollar dependency, and currency stabilization arrangements, have historically benefited from Africa's natural resources, debt obligations, and trade imbalances. One analyst present at the meeting later summarized Traoré's message in simple terms. This was not trade, this was structured dependence. But Traoré didn't stop at financial terminology. He moved into political territory, suggesting that these same institutions had indirectly shaped which African leaders rose to power, which fell, and which policies failed before they even started. This is where the controversy truly began. Because for decades, African scholars have debated something similar. The idea that global banking networks, not just governments, act as invisible architects of African development. However, few sitting African heads of state, especially Western allies, have dared to speak the claim outright. Traoré, however, spoke it without hesitation. Observers say the room fell silent as he continued, laying out examples studied by his economic advisors. He pointed to past gold sales where African nations, including Burkina Faso, reportedly sold bullion at suppressed prices due to contractual obligations tied to Western banks. He referenced how African deposits were historically held in European central banks under arrangements that limited their monetary independence. He highlighted cases where debt repayments exceeded original loan values many times over, yet the debts remained. To critics, these were exaggerated interpretations. To supporters, they were long overdue truths. To neutral observers, they were serious allegations that demanded transparency. What made Traoré's statement even more striking is that he didn't present it as a national grievance. He framed it as a continental issue, one that affected Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, and beyond. He spoke as though the financial story of Burkina Faso and the Sahel was interconnected with the broader African experience. It was the kind of message that resonated deeply across Pan-African circles. But while the room absorbed the weight of his words, Traoré is said to have delivered a final line that left his advisors stunned. This is not about the past, this is about correcting the future. According to those close to him, that phrase marked the beginning of a new economic doctrine inside Burkina Faso. It was a doctrine centered around three principles: sovereignty, transparency, and the redistribution of African value back into African hands. Within weeks of that meeting, reports from inside Burkina Faso's Ministry of Economy indicated that the government had initiated a full-scale audit of all foreign-linked financial flows over the past 30 years. Analysts noted that the audit wasn't just aimed at Western banks, but at any institution, including regional and private actors, that might have benefited unfairly from Africa's economic position. Still, Traoré's recurrent theme was that Western banks played the largest historical role. International financial commentators reacted quickly. Some minimized the claims, arguing that Africa's challenges stem from governance issues and lack of investment, not exploitation. Others argued that Traoré's perspective reflected a growing sentiment among young Africans who believe the global system has failed them. Yet many African economists countered with their own evidence, pointing to structural adjustment programs, heavy debt burdens, unequal trade terms, and currency dependency as long-standing barriers to African economic autonomy. The debate spread rapidly, and while Burkina Faso's domestic investigations continued quietly, Traoré's reputation as a leader willing to confront foreign institutions grew louder, especially when he took his critique to a global platform. During a regional summit, he delivered a speech that, according to journalists present, struck a nerve internationally. He spoke about contracts written to benefit outsiders, about loans that created dependency rather than opportunity, and about financial models that mirrored colonial hierarchies. At no point did he mention specific banks by name. At no point did he accuse individual Western countries directly. Instead, he criticized the system, a vague but powerful term that made his words difficult to dismiss, yet impossible to ignore. African youth circulated clips of the speech across social media. West African commentators called it the financial awakening speech. Activists compared it to earlier Pan-African resistance narratives. Even some Western economists admitted privately that Traoré had raised questions that the global financial community had avoided for too long. Inside Burkina Faso, the speech amplified a broader political momentum. A new generation of civil society leaders began openly discussing economic sovereignty. Universities held panels on Africa's financial future. Radio talk shows debated whether the international system truly supported African development. Traoré's critics, both inside and outside the country, accused him of oversimplifying complex issues. They argued he was using foreign institutions as a scapegoat during Burkina Faso's transition period. But supporters countered with a simple question. If the system worked, why is Africa still rich in resources but poor in outcomes? This rhetorical question became a rallying cry. Meanwhile, quietly, financial advisors close to Traoré began drafting new monetary frameworks that emphasized minimizing reliance on foreign reserve currencies, restructuring debt terms, and strengthening regional financial alliances. By the end of the year, the narrative was no longer a question of whether Traoré had made bold statements. It became a question of what he was planning next. Because according to several African analysts, the accusation was only the opening chapter. The deeper story was going to be what Burkina Faso, and potentially its neighbors, intended to build in response. And that story was just beginning. The moment Traoré's remarks began circulating across the continent, a ripple effect spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Not because the accusations were completely new. African economists had long whispered about imbalanced financial systems, but because, for the first time in years, a sitting head of state was speaking them boldly, publicly, and without hesitation. Inside major African capitals, governments watched closely. Some quietly supported the sentiment, others worried the message might strain their own foreign partnerships, but everyone agreed on one thing: the tone of African politics was shifting. It didn't take long before the first real shockwave hit. In Dakar, a prominent economist from Senegal went on national television and said, "Captain Traoré is simply revealing what archives have shown for decades." In Bamako, Mali's transitional government released a statement suggesting that the financial colonialism long criticized by scholars was now a matter for continental discussion. In Niamey, Niger's leadership made a brief but pointed comment: "Dependence must end." Western response, in contrast, was swift and defensive. Several financial commentators in Europe dismissed Traoré's claims as populist rhetoric. A well-known American think tank released a 12-page briefing questioning Burkina Faso's understanding of international banking. A European news outlet labeled the accusations dangerous conspiracy theories. But the pushback only made the debate louder. Across African social media, short clips of Traoré speaking about structural extraction began circulating like wildfire. Youth activists amplified the message not because of who said it, but because it captured a feeling that had been growing under the surface for years. It wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. For decades, Africa had been told to be patient, to integrate, to stabilize, while billions of dollars in minerals, oil, and agricultural exports left the continent every year. Meanwhile, African currencies stayed weak, debt burdens high, and foreign banks continued to hold enormous influence. Whether Traoré exaggerated or not hardly mattered. He had touched a nerve. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was even more significant. In universities, students debated the implications of financial sovereignty. Professors hosted special seminars dissecting how global debt systems had been structured since the late 20th century. Even small community radio stations held call-in shows discussing whether Burkina Faso's economic future could ever be free from foreign influence. The government, sensing the momentum, accelerated its internal audit. Teams of young Burkinabe analysts, economists, lawyers, statisticians began combing through historical data, loan records, gold export agreements, interest contracts, central bank correspondences. The goal was not only to prove exploitation but to understand how it worked. According to insiders, what they found was alarming. There were periods where Burkina Faso paid more interest every year than the value of the original loans. There were financial arrangements dating back decades that created invisible economic pressure. There were examples of gold sales at prices far below market value because of pre-agreed terms tied to Western institutions. None of this was illegal. All of it, however, raised questions. Could a system be legal, yet fundamentally unfair? Could a continent be independent, yet financially subordinated? These were the questions Traoré wanted African nations to confront openly. Meanwhile, in Western capitals, diplomats received instructions to monitor developments in Burkina Faso closely. Some were told to reach out quietly and assess whether the country was planning to change its monetary alignments. Others were warned that Traoré's rhetoric might spread to neighboring states, threatening long-standing economic arrangements. And then something unexpected happened. A confidential report from a European financial research group leaked online. The report, intended for internal circulation, acknowledged that certain African countries had indeed suffered long-term disadvantages due to the structure of international finance. It further stated that some of the historic arrangements no longer reflected modern economic realities. African audiences seized upon the leak like wildfire. Traoré did not comment on it publicly, but according to close advisors, he was not surprised. Inside the presidential compound, he was already thinking several steps ahead. The accusations against Western banks were not meant as an end. They were meant as a beginning, a justification for a new economic direction, a different model, one that allowed Africa to retain more of its value. That idea started materializing as Burkina Faso quietly initiated conversations with Mali and Niger. The objective was reportedly simple: evaluate whether the three nations could build a shared foundation for financial sovereignty. It wasn't about a new currency yet, not officially. It wasn't about leaving the global system. It was about creating enough independence to negotiate from a position of strength. Then came the turning point. Burkina Faso's audit team presented a preliminary report directly to Traoré. Sources familiar with the briefing say it outlined patterns of systemic disadvantage and historical extraction. It listed examples of unfavorable loan terms, suppressed commodity prices, and dependency creating financial structures. The language was technical, but the message was clear. We were never meant to rise. That sentence, according to insiders, is what Traoré repeated privately after reading the report. Within days, the president convened another meeting, this time not with economists but with military officials, energy experts, local business leaders, and regional representatives. He explained that economic sovereignty was not just a financial issue. It was a national security issue, a developmental issue, a generational issue. He argued that Burkina Faso could not secure its territory, empower its youth, or modernize its industries if its wealth continued to flow outward unchecked. And with that argument, he earned overwhelming support. The next phase of his plan was bold. He instructed his team to design a 10-year roadmap to reduce dependency on Western banks. That meant strengthening local industries, expanding gold processing inside Burkina Faso, building alliances with neighboring states, and exploring partnerships that didn't rely heavily on Western financial channels. International observers knew something was changing, but few understood the scale. To them, Traoré's speeches were political. To him, they were the groundwork for a new era. Still, the real pressure came when Western media began publishing articles suggesting Burkina Faso was drifting toward isolationism. Analysts debated whether Traoré's rhetoric could scare investors away. Commentators warned that criticizing Western banks might have serious economic consequences. But the warnings no longer held the same weight. Because for the first time in decades, African nations had examples of independence. Energy partnerships shifting toward Asia, security cooperation expanding with new allies, trade routes emerging across the Sahel, and alternative development models gaining credibility. Burkina Faso was no longer a follower. It was becoming a symbol. And Traoré's message, that Africa's wealth had been siphoned for generations, was beginning to reshape political conversations in countries thousands of kilometers away. The movement was no longer confined to speeches. A quiet revolution had begun. As the debate intensified across Africa and beyond, something else began unfolding quietly, something far more significant than the public speeches, the media commentary, or even the leaked financial report. Across Africa's financial sector, young economists, analysts, and technologists started forming informal networks. WhatsApp groups, Telegram channels, private Zoom rooms, all born in the span of days, filled with discussions inspired by Traoré's accusations, not to praise or blindly defend him, but to dissect the truth. They exchanged charts showing the historical outflow of African wealth. They shared documents revealing the conditions of IMF and World Bank loans. They compared interest rates, gold valuations, export agreements, and currency dependencies. Within a week, a sense of collective realization took shape. The problem was bigger than any one country. It was structural, and it had been normalized. Traoré's words had not created the truth. They had simply exposed it. Meanwhile, in Western capitals, analysts watching West Africa became increasingly uneasy. Burkina Faso was a relatively small economy, But the political symbolism of its new direction was enormous, and the fear was simple. If one country breaks the pattern, others may follow. That fear wasn't theoretical, it was already happening. In Mali, public discussions about rebuilding a sovereign financial system gained momentum. In Niger, ministers began referencing financial liberation in public speeches. In Guinea, leaders hinted at reviewing old mining agreements. Even in Ghana, Kenya, and Tanzania, although more subtle, analysts noticed shifts in language. Traoré's accusations, whether fully accurate or partially exaggerated, had ignited something that could not be put back in a box. Inside Burkina Faso, preparations for the next phase accelerated. In a dimly lit conference room in Ouagadougou, Traoré met with a group of economic advisors, military strategists, and regional coordinators. There were no cameras, no press, no speeches, just a simple wooden table, notebooks, and determination. Traoré began by pointing at a large map of Africa projected on the wall. According to insiders, he said, "We were divided so they could control us. Now we must unite so that they cannot." He wasn't talking about political union, not yet. He was talking about economic synchrony, shared resources, shared leverage, shared financial strategies. The advisors discussed the possibility of establishing a regional wealth retention plan, a system where gold, uranium, oil, and agricultural exports were processed locally before being sold. This alone could multiply revenues for several African states. Then the conversation shifted to energy. Burkina Faso, like many African nations, exported raw materials while importing expensive fuel. This dependency created constant pressure on local currencies. Traoré pushed for a regional strategy, build joint refineries, create regional energy agreements, and invite non-Western partners to help launch new infrastructure. These ideas were ambitious, maybe unrealistic to some, but Traoré insisted they were not optional. Economic dependence was a chain, he said. Economic independence required breaking links, one by one. Around this time, foreign reactions intensified. A major Western financial newspaper published a front-page story warning that authoritarian rhetoric in West Africa threatened the stability of international markets. Another European television network claimed Traoré was manipulating economic data to stir anti-Western sentiment. A U.S. analyst went as far as saying Burkina Faso's stance could invite dangerous alliances. But the louder the criticisms became, the more African audiences rallied behind the message. Because for once, the accusations weren't coming from Western journalists analyzing Africa from afar. They were coming from Africans themselves, presidents, ministers, economists, and everyday citizens. And this was what made it different. Meanwhile, small African businesses, often ignored in these conversations, began acting on the momentum. In Burkina Faso, dozens of entrepreneurs initiated projects focused on local manufacturing. In Mali and Niger, farmers' cooperatives met to discuss how they could reduce reliance on imported fertilizers and seeds. In Senegal, tech startups explored building payment systems outside of Western frameworks. People weren't just listening. They were responding. But all movements attract opposition, and this one was no different. Western banks, sensing the shift, began issuing subtle warnings to African governments about the importance of maintaining financial stability. Some institutions suggested that sudden moves toward sovereignty could result in market uncertainty, a phrase African leaders had heard countless times before. African ministers, however, were no longer intimidated so easily. The continent had new partners now: Russia, China, the Gulf, Turkey, India. If one door closed, another could open, and this multipolar reality made Traoré's accusations much harder to suppress. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré's team finalized a confidential document, a long-term blueprint detailing how the country could gradually reduce dependency on Western financial channels. The plan focused on 4 pillars: monetary reform, regional alliances, industrial transformation, and local value retention. Nothing was made public yet, but preparations were already underway. Burkina Faso was rethinking its development model from the ground up. But perhaps the most powerful development came unexpectedly. In a major African capital, a respected former finance minister, long thought to be a supporter of Western economic structures, delivered a surprising speech. He said, "For decades we were told to trust the system, but the system was never neutral. It was built on our resources. What President Traoré is saying may sound radical, but sometimes the truth is radical." The statement shocked international observers, because it meant the movement was no longer radical at all. It was becoming mainstream. And that was precisely what Western banks feared. Not Burkina Faso alone, not Traoré alone, but the possibility that African nations might finally realize the strength of their collective wealth. As this new reality formed, a slow shift began in diplomatic circles. Whispered conversations privately acknowledged that the African financial model might need reassessment. But reassessment threatened profit, and profit had shaped global policy for decades. The tug-of-war between narrative and reality grew sharper. Traoré, meanwhile, remained unbothered by external noise. He continued working, planning, consulting, meeting. He knew the accusations were only step one. Because if Africa was to reclaim its wealth, the truth had to be spoken first. Then it had to be understood. Then it had to be acted upon. And now, all across the continent, people were beginning to act. The movement was no longer a speech, no longer a debate, no longer a controversy. It was becoming a continental awakening. The final days of that historic month brought scenes the world had not witnessed from Africa in generations. In the heart of Ouagadougou, crowds filled the streets waving flags not of protest, but of pride. Young people held up handwritten signs with simple words, "Our wealth, our future." Others chanted, "No more banks of chains," echoing the rallying cry that Traoré's fiery speech had sparked. Inside the presidential compound, the air was heavy but charged with optimism. Traoré sat at a long wooden table surrounded by advisors, economists, and military officers. In front of them lay several folders, draft proposals, agreements, and new frameworks. Each document represented a step toward economic independence, and each came with risk. But Traoré, as always, looked calm. One of his advisors reminded him of the obvious. Western media would continue attacking his government, calling him defiant, reckless, and dangerous. He smiled slightly and said, "Let them write. One day they'll write the truth." He looked up from the papers, leaned back in his chair, and continued. "For 60 years they said Africa cannot stand on its own, but I've seen the strength of our people. I've seen young men building with their hands, women trading with dignity, and elders teaching with pride. What we lack is not potential. What we lack is control." The room went silent for a few seconds. Everyone knew what he meant: control of money, control of trade, control of destiny. Later that week, a secret meeting took place between representatives of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It was a continuation of their growing alliance, a bond forged in shared struggle and shared hope. The meeting lasted all night, and by morning they had agreed to form an informal economic bloc dedicated to self-financing projects without Western lenders. It was a bold idea. Some said impossible, but so had been every great African revolution before it began. They called it the Sovereign Fund of the Sahel. The plan was simple: pool a percentage of gold, uranium, and agricultural exports into a collective reserve, a fund to be used for regional infrastructure, defense, and technology. No strings attached, no loans, no interest rates dictated by foreign institutions. It would be Africa's first self-financed developmental framework in modern times. When word of the plan leaked, Western analysts dismissed it as symbolic. But symbols have power, and in this case that power spread quickly. Other nations, Guinea, Chad, and even small island states like Cape Verde expressed interest in joining. It was no longer a Burkina Faso story. It was becoming an African story. And Traoré knew it. That night, in a televised address to the nation, he stood before a backdrop of the national flag and spoke with measured conviction. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "they say we are poor. But how can a land filled with gold, oil, and sunlight be poor? They say we are weak. But how can a continent of 1 billion souls be weak? No, we are not poor. We are not weak. We are awakening." He paused as the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Then his tone sharpened. They called their institutions banks, but they were chains. They said they were helping, but they were taking. They said aid, but meant control. Those days are over. We will no longer trade our resources for crumbs while our people starve. The entire square roared with emotion. People shouted his name. Drums pounded. Women wept and danced in the streets. For the first time, the word independence did not sound like a memory from history books. It sounded alive, as if reborn. Meanwhile, in Western financial centers, a quiet panic grew. Think tanks began releasing reports about growing financial nationalism in Africa. Stock analysts debated how resource nationalism might affect global markets. Behind closed doors, diplomats discussed containment strategies, code for ways to slow the ripple effect before it reached other continents. But the momentum could not be stopped. Because for every analyst in London or Washington warning about instability, there were 1 million Africans who finally felt stable in their belief that they deserved better. In Burkina Faso, a new generation of students started forming economic clubs in universities to study local wealth management. Small-town mayors began introducing policies to use local materials for development. And even in remote villages, where people had no access to the internet or television, word spread through radio and conversation. Our president said no to the banks. It became more than a political decision. It became a moral declaration. One day, while speaking to a group of young journalists, Traoré was asked if he feared retaliation from global powers. He smiled and replied softly, "When a people are no longer afraid to lose what they don't have, they become unstoppable. We have nothing to lose and everything to build." That line echoed across the continent like thunder. In Nairobi, in Accra, in Kinshasa, African citizens began quoting him on social media, painting murals with his words, turning speeches into songs. The message was anti-West. It was pro-dignity. It wasn't rebellion. It was restoration. Months later, a major Western news outlet reluctantly published a headline that read, "Burkina Faso's economic defiance gains traction across Africa." Even they could no longer deny the movement that had begun. Inside the halls of the IMF, quiet discussions began about restructuring African loan models. But for many Africans, the gesture was too little, too late. The psychological shift had already happened. The people were awake. The illusion of financial dependency was fading. And that was the real victory. Not a policy, not a signature, but a change in belief. As the sun set over Ouagadougou one evening, Traoré stood at a balcony overlooking the city. The lights below flickered, evidence of progress and imperfection coexisting. He spoke softly to an aide beside him. "Look at them," he said, pointing to the streets filled with laughter and movement. "They are beginning to dream again. That's how empires fall, not when we fight them, but when we stop fearing them." The aide nodded silently. Then Traoré turned back toward the horizon and added one last line. Tell the world Africa's wealth is coming home. And with that, he walked back into his office to prepare for yet another dawn of rebuilding. If you enjoyed this story, and you believe in Africa's awakening, make sure to subscribe, stay tuned, and keep watching. Because this is just the beginning. The story of Africa's freedom is still being written, and you are watching history unfold.